Thank you everyone for joining us today in what is our final native plant connection webinar in our webinar series. Today I'm really excited because we're going to present to you the results of the first national survey of native plant growers, specifically serving the ornamental plant market. I do want to acknowledge the USDA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, their Specialty Crop Research Initiative, which provided the funds for this webinar series, our newsletter, the survey, really all of the elements of the Native Plant Connection Project. If you're interested in learning more about the Native Plant Connection Project, you can find out more by visiting our website. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gail Langellotto. In the photo to the right, I'm holding an insect suction sampler known as a pooter. I'm trained as an entomologist from the University of Maryland, specifically an insect ecologist, and at Oregon State University, a lot of my work really revolves around understanding how we can plan and plant gardens so that they are hospitable habitats for a variety of insects. In particular, our group has had a large focus on bees over time. So now that I've done the quick introduction of myself, I want to launch straight into today's webinar. Just know that we'd really love to hear your thoughts on whether or not this webinar series has been useful for you, whether or not the newsletter, if you subscribe to it, has been useful to you at all. We're really trying to use this particular webinar as an opportunity to wrap up that USDA planning grant. I'm trying to set the stage to form a national network of native plant nursery growers and really think about what the next stage of this project will look like. There's a short survey that we're going to ask you to take at the end of today's webinar. If you want to get your cell phone out and just take a photo of that QR code, you can start working through the survey during the webinar itself. And I think Jen is also going to drop a link to that survey into chat. Our map for today, what we're going to go over, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the genesis of this Native Plant Connection project because I think it helps put our activities in context, how the project came to be, what we were hoping to accomplish, etc. Then I want to spend the bulk of today's webinar going over the survey results. I will note that for the final report of our Native Plant Nursery survey, is posted on our website. So if you want to take a look at the Native Plant Connection website, you'll find the full report on that website as well. And then I'm going to wrap up by talking about what we hope to do next, the next iteration of this project, and how you specifically can stay informed of what we're doing. And if you'd like to be involved, we'd love to have you present a couple of options for how you can specifically be involved. So first, I want to talk about the early roots of the Native Plant Connection project. As I mentioned, I'm a professor of horticulture at Oregon State University. For 16 years, I was the statewide coordinator of our university's Extension Master Gardener program. And after several years in the Extension Master Gardener program, I realized that there was a real opportunity to fill in some of those knowledge gaps we have about sustainable garden planting and management. And that's why I started the Garden Ecology Lab at Oregon State University. Dr. Erin Anderson, who now works with the Nursery Society, was my first PhD student in the Garden Ecology Lab. And Erin was really interested in understanding those bees and other insects that can be found on Pacific Northwest wildflowers. He did a field study of insect native plant species associations with 23 different species of Pacific Northwest wildflowers planted out at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center as 1 meter squared plots, which you can see circled here or squared here in the red, where he would sit and watch bee visits. He would use a vacuum sampler to suction insects off. But really, I'd say this is where I first started thinking about native plant nurseries and really supply and demand issues. In order to get enough plants to fill out 115 native plant plots with 23 native plant species, Aaron had to go to somewhere between 10 and 15 different native plant nurseries. And I would say that he really, there were many more nurseries that he visited that were dead ends on his search for these native plants. So this is where I really started thinking about supply chain issues with native plants for garden settings. And then I'll say for one of the flowering plant species that Aaron studied, which has become particularly beloved in our lab group, Clarkia amoena, commonly known as farewell to spring. This plant is both beautiful, and we really came to love Clarkia specifically because it's heavily used by leaf cutting bees, petal cutting bees, who will cut little discs of the Clarkia petals to take them back to line their nest. It's just such a beautiful image, if you will, to have these bees literally wrapping their babies, their developing larvae, in the petals of native wildflowers. But for this particular native plant species, on the native plant nursery list that we consulted, it was only listed for sale at a single nursery. Aaron had a particularly hard time trying to source this particular plant. And when I did a rapid search for Clarkia amoena on Google Shopping this morning, the top hits that come up are all cultivars of Clarkia amoena. Talking with the master gardeners that I worked with in my job as well, as we started to advertise some of the results of Aaron's study, the gardeners themselves would report back like, oh my gosh, I really love Lobgilly, or I love Clarkia, but I don't know where to find them. I've searched everywhere, I can't find them. Or they've told me that they took our recommendations and they bought and planted wildflowers that we were suggesting as being particularly beneficial to bees and other beneficial insects in garden spaces. And come to find out, we realized that they had a cultivar that was either lightly or highly bred. And I think that this problem is not very unique to us. This is a screen cap from the Native Plant Horticulture Foundation, a quote from Doug Tallamy, who's like, to be highly credited for the growth in a lot of the native plant nursery industry for gardens. Everywhere I go, people ask me, where can I find these plants? Who can I hire to do this work? And I have to say to them, I don't know. So started having these ideas about the fact that demand for native plants was growing rapidly. However, native plant availability was difficult to get a handle around, particularly if you were using less common native plant species. They were very difficult to find. We had to utilize a lot of pop-up native plant sales to fill out our study and research plots, or look for native plant retail nurseries, which oftentimes had shopping by appointment only or were closed for large portions of the season. So really just started thinking about the fact that everyone I knew and worked with was really excited about getting more native plants in the ground in garden spaces. But we all seem to be struggling with these same issues of variable supply or lack of knowledge on our part for where we go to find these plants. And that's when I started having conversations with other members of the Native Plant Connection team about really the complexity of the native plant nursery ecosystem, how many different players are involved in making native plants available, talking about the amount of knowledge that is embedded in this native plant nursery ecosystem, but that a lot of that knowledge is highly segmented. Even though individual growers might possess a wealth of knowledge, that knowledge isn't broadly available across the industry. And the further you move through the supply chain, information related to the technical aspects of native plant production and use seem to be lost. When talking to others about this idea about a native plant nursery network, we realized that there were a lot of growers, a lot of professionals who independently had knowledge about how different native plants could be used in ornamental landscapes. Whether or not a novel native plant, which might be introduced to the marketplace, really had any potential demand by gardeners or landscapers to begin with. And the knowledge about propagation of native plants to serve the ornamental marketplace also seemed to be independently siloed, if you will. So we started thinking about what if we can get folks together to share information, to network with each other, to support each other as one way to grow the native plant nursery industry. And so that's when I reached out to Cammie Donaldson, who I met through another USDA-funded project, the National Initiative for Consumer Horticulture. Cammie, with her work through the Florida Association of Native Plant Nurseries, has such a wealth of information related to what native plant nursery growers need, how best we can serve their needs, and started cooking up this idea of putting a proposal together to launch this project. Cammie knew Roger Triplett, who was a longtime native plant nursery grower who was very generous in sharing his ideas, his perspective, his priorities with us, which helped to form a lot of the ideas that form the basis of this project. Cammie also brought in Sandy Wilson, who did our webinar last year on native plant propagation. A lot of questions that we're hearing from growers are, how do you propagate this plant? How do you propagate that plant? Sandy is a wealth of knowledge in that regard for Southeastern natives. Cammie also helped to bring in Alicia Wren, who did an earlier webinar for our group on marketing native plants to today's gardeners. And then we knew that we wanted to survey the industry, and I had worked with the OSU Survey Research Center for other projects in the past. Jenny Lesser and Lydia Newton are the two folks I work closely with at the OSU Survey Research Center. And coincidentally, Jenny was a statistician on the National Academy's assessment of native seed needs and their capacity for supply. So she was incredibly helpful in helping us to come up with a survey, surveying a somewhat different group. The National Academy's report focused on native plant growers that were serving the restoration market. We were really trying to get a handle on what folks feel, what their perspectives are when you're a native plant grower serving ornamental marketplaces. Megan Avolio is someone that I knew when I was at Fordham University in New York City. Plant population geneticist, really helped us to fine-tune some of the questions we had about native plant conservation genetics. And Orville Baldus is the lead of a multi-state extension project, bringing together extension professionals working in the realm of native plants. So I was really happy to get such an esteemed team together, willing to tackle this problem all at once. Really have to give a shout out for Mallory Mead, who was an undergraduate in the garden ecology lab. She did most of the heavy lifting in helping to populate our database of native plant nursery growers serving ornamental marketplaces. Leanne Locker, who I work closely with on the Master Gardener program in Oregon, who helped us a lot with brand identity and some of the visuals associated with this project. And Jen Hayes, who's in the background today, dropping links in the chat, serving as co-host for almost all of these webinars. And Jen also gave a webinar herself on her research related to pollinator use of native plants and cultivars of those native plants. So first, let's get into the survey effort itself. The survey was really envisioned as a starting point rather than a starting point to facilitate the formation of a national native plant growers network. Because of the regionality of native plants, we knew that there had to be some sort of regionalization to the network. We put together one iteration of what these regional hubs might look like. We tried to do this by looking at an EPA ecoregion map and then drawing lines as best as we could along state lines, really because we didn't know of a better way to do it. If you have a suggestion for how to better define what regional hubs for native plant nursery growers might look like, we would love to hear from you. We always thought it was important for this native plant growers network to have growers at the very center of the efforts. This idea to put growers at the center of the network aligns with one of the written comments that we had in the survey itself, where someone shared that they would be supportive of a network if it was outside of corporate, government, and university control. And you can see in our early iteration of what this network might look like, we did put university extension academic researchers along the periphery of what this network might look like, supporting the centered needs of native plant producers themselves. I want to tell you a little bit about how we try to put a frame around who would be surveyed. We were really lucky that Dr. Rick Martinson, who is a native plant propagator and grower for several decades in Central Oregon, as well as someone that has a landscaping and restoration element of this business. He did his PhD at Oregon State University in the Department of Horticulture, where I'm at, and as part of his PhD work, he put together a list of 342 propagation nurseries, which he shared with us as a starting place for our own survey. However, Rick was really focused on native plant propagation nurseries, which left a lot of the wholesalers, which left a lot of the retailers out of the list. By scouring the web, Mallory Mead was able to grow the list to 825 growers, sellers of native plants. Mallory was aided very effectively by Cammie Donaldson and Emma at the Florida Association of Native Plant Nurseries. One thing I want to note, which was a recurring theme when we start looking at list of native plant nursery growers, is that Rick came up with his list of native plant propagation nurseries in 2020. We vetted that list and built off of that list in 2023. And in that time period, 19% of the propagation nurseries on Rick's original list had gone out of business. And this is something that we see repeatedly when we start looking at these native plant grower lists. They are highly dynamic, which notes the importance of, if we do have a list of national native plant nurseries, how is it going to be kept up to date and accurate? I mentioned this National Academies report, which just came out a few months ago, looking at native seed growers serving the restoration market. And I want to pull out a couple of select conclusions from this final report, which I think are particularly relevant to the work we're trying to do with native plant nursery growers serving ornamental markets. First, they found that suppliers viewed the unpredictable demand for native plant seed for restoration purposes as a leading challenge. A lot of restoration orders are going in after a natural disaster or a wildfire, and it really is difficult, if not impossible, for seed growers to predict what species are going to be needed, how much acreage is going to need to be restored. So in this sense, we see an opportunity for the ornamental marketplace to provide stability to a highly unstable restoration market. The National Academy's report noted that there are many technical and scientific information gaps that are affecting native seed supply. We're seeing the same thing with native plants for ornamental markets. There are so many technical and scientific questions which need to be answered, providing a wealth of opportunities. The report also noted that there are regional networks on the ground and that further developing these regional networks can stabilize demand, expand supply, and increase the sharing of information and technology in order to meet native seed needs. We suggest the same thing potentially is important for native plant growers serving ornamental markets, that a network will benefit the profession and a network will benefit the customers. So we ended up serving 825 native plant nursery growers with the intention of reaching those serving ornamental markets. We had an unadjusted response rate of 40%. Using the American Association for Public Opinion adjusted response rate, which takes out businesses which had closed, folks who broke off the survey, or those for which we had bad emails, we had an adjusted response rate of 43%. When I asked the OSU Survey Research Center, is that a good response rate? They told me that it really depends upon what the ultimate intentions of our survey were. So I'm calling it a good response rate. In particular, I'm calling it a good response rate because when I go through the literature and I looked at response rates for other surveys that were surveying similar groups, nursery growers, we see generally lower response rates across all studies, ranging from 12% to 27%. The only nursery grower survey that I could find that had a relatively comparable or higher response rate was this one published in 2002 by Wallachek and colleagues with a response rate of 48%. That specific survey was focused on employment and labor issues in the nursery industry. The others were focused more on similar topics to our particular survey. What are high priority research, extension, marketing needs? So we wanted to know whether or not we actually reached our target audience, native plant nursery growers. When we asked folks what type of organization they were and what are the different elements of their business, they could check multiple options for this particular question. We found that retail nurseries were by far the best represented from the group that we surveyed. For all of the survey questions that I'm going to show you, you can see the total sample size of folks that answered right here. Note that not all, the way we had survey logic set up, not all people saw all questions. So it's going to be variable numbers of responses for each question. And then we asked folks, okay, so you do all of these different things in your business. You do some landscape installation and maintenance. You might do some restoration. Which activity generates the most revenue for you? And once again, retail nurseries were best represented in our survey group. We wanted to make sure that we were actually surveying native plant professionals. So we asked them what % of their inventory, if they were selling plants, were actually made up of native plants. And we found that 80% had a majority of their inventory, 51% or more, in native plants, and 19% had a minority of native plants in their inventory. We also wanted to know whether or not folks were selling native cultivars for sale. We found that 41% said that they offer no native plant cultivars for sale, but adding up those percentage parts where folks were selling native plant cultivars, we found that a majority of the folks that we surveyed were. So just comparing this to that National Academy's report, where they found that 54% of native seed suppliers serving the restoration market don't sell cultivars. Compare that to 41% in our survey. 40% of native seed suppliers serving the restoration market sold some cultivars. Compare that to 58% of in our survey. We also asked folks whether or not they were breeding native plants to produce cultivars, and we found that 58%, the majority, don't participate in any native plant selection or breeding. But for those that do, the features which were most commonly selected for were focused on native plant aesthetics, flower color and size, foliage, fall color, winter interest, compactness, bloom longevity. These were all the most common features selected when we asked folks about native plant breeding. And then when I look at the written comments for this particular question, I see a real gradient of responses from folks that repeatedly wrote like, no, I'm not breeding. I'm really interested in maintaining strict species. Some folks who said, you know, I'm really selecting for hardiness to my particular area, so perhaps breeding for climate resilience. And then there were some folks, this is one verbatim quote, whatever the market desires is what I'm breeding or selecting for. We also asked folks who their most common customer base were, who did they sell to, and you can see that gardeners at 88% near the bottom were the most frequently selected customer base for our survey group. So we're starting to feel more confident that we actually are reaching who we intended to reach, native plant nursery growers serving the ornamental market. In terms of the forms of native plants sold, containers were most commonly selected, liners and plugs, seeds, field-grown plants were also selected, and in that 1% other category, those were cut flowers and bare root native plants. We wanted to know what types of native plants were being sold. Wildflowers, grasses, woody shrubs were most common. Large trees, wetland and aquatic plants were also well represented. Ferns, and in the other category, that included vines, cacti, edibles, sedges, palms, or more broadly, perennials. So at this point, I was feeling pretty good. We really did set out to survey native plant nursery growers and sellers serving ornamental markets. And I think that we made a great case that we reached that target audience. Most common responses included those from retail outlets serving gardeners, and most outlets had a majority of their inventory in native plants. So let's talk a little bit about the growing practices used by folks who responded to our survey. And here, I really started to think about some of the drivers in restoration nursery seed sales versus retail nursery native plant sales, and that they're somewhat overlapping, but also distinctly different business types. And I'll get into that a little more in the next few slides. I do want to say for those folks who are interested and didn't know about this excellent docuseries about the native seed supply chain, specifically folks working in restoration markets, that check out this docuseries. It is riveting, and the full-length documentary version should be coming out tomorrow. So when I talk about the different drivers of native plant marketplaces, I kind of see this trade-off between function in the restoration market and aesthetics in the ornamental plant market. And when we think about function in the restoration market, you know, if you're selling to BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, for large-scale restorations, there's some language in the types of seeds that they're looking for, that the seeds and plants should be genetically appropriate, locally adapted. Ecotypes are all of the types of language that you can see in those BLM restoration efforts. So whereas to sell native plants for restoration, you really need to pay key attention to function, and maybe you don't have to pay any attention to the aesthetics of those plants. It's a very different circumstance when you're selling native plants for gardens, when right now, as far as I know, there's no language about what the genetics or the local adaptation of native plants for gardens should be. No formal language anyway, and really a big driver in the marketplace for gardeners, landscapers, and others are, what do those plants look like? And then that brings us to an interesting conundrum, because if the conservation genetics and the genetic diversity of native plants used for restoration are a key element of the beneficial functions that those plants play, then we're caught in a little bit of a trade-off between maintaining that genetic diversity and scaling up production. So I know that I'm grossly oversimplifying this at the moment, but if we think about genetic diversity being maximized when you have sexual reproduction and the production of seeds, and you have genetic diversity being minimized if you're using an asexual propagation technique such as cuttings, then once again, we have this trade-off between the propagation methods used and adopted by nurseries serving the restoration market. And for any native plant nursery grower that wants to scale up to any meaningful volume, once you move to an asexual propagation technique, then that has the potential to reduce one of the key benefits and functions that folks associate with native plants. We did ask a couple of questions about what native plant nursery growers are doing to maintain genetic variation when collecting and propagating plants. When collecting seed, we see that 83% are using some methods to maintain genetic variation, including collecting seed from multiple plants at multiple sites, collecting seeds from multiple plants at a single site, or only collecting seed where plants are abundant. Less mentioned was that folks swap seed with other growers. Then we asked folks what they're doing to maintain genetic variation in plants which are propagated by seed in the nursery themselves. And we're seeing a little bit of a drop. We still have most growers are doing something to maintain genetic variation in seed propagated plants, 66%. But it is a reduction in what we saw in the previous slide, 80-some% using methods in collected seed. The things that native plant nursery growers are doing to maintain genetic variation in seed propagated plants is maintaining site parent lines that represent genetic variation of the wild populations and introducing plants from other sources to try to increase variation in their parent plant population. And then we asked folks what they're doing to maintain genetic variation in plants propagated via cuttings. Here, we're seeing a further reduction and folks responding affirmatively that they're using methods to maintain genetic variation in native plants propagated from cuttings. We went from 83% in collected seed, 66% in plants propagated by seed, and now we're down to 54% in plants propagated from cuttings. Methods used to maintain genetic diversity in plants propagated by cuttings included using cuttings from multiple plants on site or using cuttings from multiple plants in the wild. I'm really interested in this entire question of genetic diversity in plants propagated by cuttings, and kind of like this tension between wanting to scale up production, but also wanting to maintain and preserve genetic diversity. When I go back to Dr. Megan Avolio's webinar on preserving genetic diversity in native plants that was part of this webinar series, she shared with us two studies that looked at a reduction in genetic diversity in nursery propagated tilia trees, nursery propagated linden trees. In one study that was conducted in Belgium, and I can't remember the other place, maybe the Netherlands, they found that a survey of 129 tilia trees was composed primarily of 2 to 3 genetically identical clones. When they went back and sampled heritage trees that have been in the landscape much longer, we saw a broadening of genetic diversity within those trees, but still only represented by 12 clones. Another study looking at tilia trees in a Danish historical planting spanning 250 years found that 92% of the linden trees planted at this site were all from a single clone. So if we think of genetic diversity once again as a key benefit that contributes to the positive function of native plants in the landscape, then I think that some of these questions are really interesting to ask and think about what a sustainable strategy for production could be that also preserves the genetic diversity of native plants. I want to note that there are very few studies that I could find looking at native plant genetic diversity in urban landscapes. One notable exception was published in 2019 in Hort Science, which looked at genetic diversity in rhododendron connections. And they found that diversity between different rhododendron populations was relatively low, which they attributed to gene exchange being facilitated by pollinators in the landscape. But they found that the proportion of genetic diversity within populations was relatively high. We also asked folks whether or not they use or provide source-identified plants or ecotypes to their customers, or if they seek them out from their suppliers. And here we found that only a minority of respondents say that they are always requesting source-identified plants from suppliers, only 21%, or always providing source-identified plants to their customers, only 17%. You'll note that folks who wrote "sometimes I do" constituted a large proportion of respondents, but I really don't know what sometimes means. Does that mean like once in a while or most of the time? It would be interesting to drill a little bit further down into what that sometimes response means. Then we asked about ecotypes and whether or not folks who are producing ecotypes, whether they are selling those ecotypes outside of their ecoregion, and the majority wrote yes, they do. Only a minority, 35%, wrote that they don't use or purchase ecotypes from outside of the region. Moving on now to the high priority research and extension needs identified by the respondents in our survey. And we broke up the research and extension needs into production, as well as end use and marketing. And one of the things which was interesting for me to see, folks could choose multiple options in this particular survey, is that almost every option we provided was listed as very or moderately important as a priority sourcing and production strategy. Folks wanted more information for sustainably sourcing native plant starts or seeds, wanted to see guidelines developed for sustainable collection of native plant seed for an ornamental market. Propagation repeatedly came up as a key need, soft pesticides for growing native plants, propagation protocols that preserve plants' genetic diversity, but also allow native plant production as a larger scale, irrigation-free landscapes, and seed biology to enhance production practices were all listed as very or moderately important. In the other category, what was interesting for me to see is that a lot of the priorities that were written in had to do with like, make sure that the new nurseries, make sure that the new nurseries understand how to set a competitive price point without pricing their plants too low, or really focused on business practices for new native plant nurseries. In terms of marketing and end use strategies, once again, everything that we put out there is, do you consider this to be important, was pretty much selected as something of importance to our grower base, including support for marketing to a broader customer base, guidelines for the sale and use of native plants, including defining what the role of cultivars could or should be, generating pollinator and wildlife use by plants by region, native plant selections for urban landscapes that might include compact forms or non-suckering cultivars, ground covers as turf alternatives, quantifying how native plants help offset invasions, identifying native plants for irrigation-free landscapes, supplying to restoration efforts, ecological benefits of native plants, and determining the value and importance of ecotypes, if any. Also developing landscape designs that promote the use of native plants. Some of the written comments I wanted to share is that folks repeatedly said that they wanted a database of producers to facilitate faster ordering and identification of hard-to-find plant species and their origin. Ecotypes repeatedly came up in written comments, even though they were provided as an option folks could choose. Increasing public awareness of the negative impacts of invasive exotics and the benefits of native plants. How to design and install native plants, the use of biocontrol, plastic-free propagation and distribution alternatives, soil mixes, synthetic-free fertilization practices, what the customer wants, propagation of rare and endangered species, developing the talent pipeline for production jobs, the care of wild populations, tools to help guide stratification, timing, seed quantities unique to each species, cover crops for seed production plots, and working with state and local government to require native local plants in new construction were all written in comments, kind of broadly categorized for this slide. So you can see that there was no shortage of research and extension priorities identified by folks via this survey. So getting towards the end of today's presentation, I just want to share some what folks responded in terms of their thoughts on network structure. Remember that this project really was put into motion to try to set a stage for a native plant nursery network with growers at the center of the network itself. And I really want to give a shout out to the Florida Association of Native Nurseries, FAN, and their executive director, Cammie Donaldson, who also is the executive director of the Native Plant Horticulture Foundation, because we took so much inspiration from the long-term work and successes, as well as the lessons learned that FAN so generously shared with our group. And then just to give another shout out for USDA support of our project, Cammie and I actually met each other on another USDA funded project, planning project, setting up the National Initiative for Consumer Horticulture. So talking about the benefits of the network, the supply and demand mismatch comes up repeatedly. This is a screen cap of native plants in the news that was sent out in one of our Native Plant Connection newsletters, where a group in Oklahoma launched a nonprofit cooperative to try to basically form a network on the ground that could help meet the demand for native plants that they're seeing skyrocket locally. What we really need are more native plant growers, Stewart said. People want native plants and they talk to their landscaper who designed something, and then nobody can find the native plants they need. This is something we see repeatedly in the news and that we hear repeatedly on the ground. And then also something that I think is something which could come up and be of importance to a native plant nursery network is there is discussion of legislation that invokes the use of native plants in some instances. Oregon's US Senator Jeff Merkley proposed the pollinator-friendly plant labeling program supported by the Nursery Society. This is a screen cap of a press release from the Nursery Society. And the point that I want to highlight is that in the language of this legislation, which is under consideration, is that plants must be native to the United States and must not have been grown using pesticides or substances not approved for use in organically grown products. So what appears to be happening here is that folks are recognizing that the word native and native plants is a value added proposition, that consumers are seeking out native plants, perhaps the way that they might have been seeking out organically produced food, and that folks are having very heated debates about the role that native plants should play in this idea. And wouldn't it be great if we had a native plant network that could serve as a voice for growers and contribute to this debate? So we asked folks, what type of structure would you like to see in a native plant network? And I'll note that only a minority of folks said that they wanted a formalized membership association with traditional communications and events and traditional membership fees. That most folks were interested in an online community organized by state or ecoregion, relatively informal, and no dues, please, was something we repeatedly saw. We asked folks about what elements and activities they'd like to see in a native plant nursery growers network. And the number one thing which was selected at 68% was this accessible, searchable online directory of native plant growers. And many people wrote in, as well as the inventory of the plants that they sell. When I talked about the number of native plant nursery businesses that went out of business in the 3 years between when Dr. Rick Martinson shared his propagation nursery list with us and when we conducted this survey, I think that that's going to be a repeated challenge to keeping an online, up-to-date, and accurate list of growers, much less the inventory that they have to offer. Other things that folks wanted to see: networking events, either virtual or in person, educational events, either in person or virtual, marketing supports, and supports for key research concerns. I want to talk about this list problem, if you will, the difficulties that are incurred with trying to make and keep an accurate list of native plant nursery growers, as well as their inventory. Folks in our survey said that they wanted to be able to send customers to a nearby grower who was growing and selling plants that they weren't, but they didn't always know where to send folks to. Really want to give a shout out for the National Wildlife Federation Garden for Wildlife program, which seems to have been making really big strides in trying to create this online list with associated inventory. You can click on a state. You can say what type of plants you're looking for, and not only will a list of native plants that are suitable for your zip code come up, but you can actually purchase them at the site as well. One thing to note about the Garden for Wildlife program is that only states in the eastern half of the US are currently represented, and that when you look at the plants which are available for quick purchase on that site, it tends to be a relatively small selection of what the total native plant palette could be. I do want to say that if there's anyone on this call who works at all with this program, the Garden for Wildlife program, or could help put me in contact with someone at the National Wildlife Federation Garden for Wildlife program, I would love to talk to them in terms of working together to address common goals. There are lots of other efforts that I've heard of, have been made aware of through the course of this past project year: the Florida Seed Network and Seed Partnership, Plant Agent Collective, the National Native Seed Network, demonstration plots in the ground in Texas, the Ecological Health Network, excuse me, and conference gatherings at Cultivate are all efforts that I've heard about that are trying to organize native plant growers to enable professional networking, but also to help address this supply-demand issue. So I want to talk about next steps, where we're going next with this, where we hope to go next with this. This particular project, the Native Plant Connection Project, was supported by a USDA SCRI planning grant of about $40,000. That $40,000 was used to pay the Survey Research Center, to pay the undergrads who worked in my lab to help build the native plant list, to pay some of the speakers who contributed to this webinar series. We would love to take it the next step and to effectively compete for a coordinated agriculture project, which would provide 4 to 5 years of funding to truly kick off this idea of a native plant nursery growers network, specifically serving ornamental marketplaces. These types of projects typically provide 4 to 5 years of funding and a median and mean award of a little bit less than $6 million. We know that it's going to be a heavy lift to get a native plant network set up and launched, and we want to get good people in place to do that work. We want to pay them for the time that they're putting towards that effort. And we want to engage researchers and extension professionals who can start chipping away at some of those high priority research and extension items that were identified in our survey. So we would love to work with you if you're interested in working with us. We expect that the request for applications is going to come out sometime in the fall, be due sometime in early 2024. We're really trying to use this as an opportunity to set the stage, to get the funding, to get this network in place. You'll remember that folks said, I'm interested in a network, but I don't want to pay dues. And I understand that that's the case because this network is just like a figment of someone's imagination at this moment. And folks don't know whether or not the network is going to be beneficial or serve people's needs. We're hoping that if we're able to successfully compete for a grant, which will fund the formation of the network, it'll give the network enough time to mature to the point where growers would see a benefit to pay dues, giving sustainability to the project. And I'll say in all transparency, like I was just kind of like the typing person putting ideas together for many people. I'm not interested in leading this network, but I really see the benefits of it. And I hope that we can attract the right people who could help lead the formation of this network and then also provide leadership at the regional level. In our original survey, we got about 140 folks who said, yes, sign me up. I'm interested in contributing to this network in some way, shape, or form, which really made me feel a lot better. If we go back to our original draft idea of what this native plant network with regional hubs might look like, and if I coarsely just use my mouse to draw on the lines for what those regional hubs look like, I'm happy to see that we have representation from all of the hubs that were in our original proposal. So at this point, as we get towards the end of our time together, I just want to share the QR code for the survey once again. I want to hear whether or not you found this webinar series or the newsletter that we provided through the course of this project year to be useful. Would love any suggestions to make them more useful for you. What types of key priorities resonate with you as things which need to be solved to sustainably grow a native plant nursery network, and your thoughts on native plant networks in general and regional hubs. There's my name, Gail Langellotto, my email, gail.langellotto@oregonstate.edu. I'd love to hear from you at any point if you have questions, if you have criticisms, if you have concerns, if you have enthusiasm. If you're interested in this project at all, please reach out to me. The survey is one quick and easy way to do that, but you can also email me as well. And with that, I'm going to the question and answer pod. where I see a great question by Kim wanting to know whether or not the companies were all of the respondents companies that grow native plants. What about retailers who do not grow but buy from wholesalers? Not all of the companies grew native plants. We knew when we asked folks what types of activities do they participate in their business, that retailers were the #1 answer. And then when we asked folks which activity generates the most revenue, we saw once again retail generated the most answers. And then I also want you to look at the sample size and N of 315 when we're just asking about what types of activities does your business engage in. But when we asked folks how they're growing plants and how they're propagating plants, you can see that the number of respondents drops by about 1/3. So we can infer from that that many of the people who responded to our survey were sellers who were sourcing their plants by buying from actual growers. And I'm going through chat real quick to see if I see any questions that I need to respond to. I'm seeing, thank you, Jen, for being so great. So great for addressing questions in chat and for dropping all of those links in. I think you were, as always, totally on the ball for addressing the questions that came up. So yes, thank you for being here today. I encourage you to please take a moment to reach out to me if you're interested in being involved in the next steps of this project. We really do hope to get some good funding to support the growth and sustainability of native plant nursery growers. And just thank you for being here today. So grateful to all of you and hope we cross paths in the near future. Thanks, folks.